Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Palmer, Chief Counsel at the Commission. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Harvard Law professor David Wilkins. Professor Wilkins serves as the Vice Dean for Global Initiatives on the Legal Profession and Faculty Director of the Center on the Legal Profession at Harvard Law. I can attest that every time I hear Professor Wilkins speak, I come away with valuable insights in our profession, and I'm sure today will be no exception. So without further ado, Professor Wilkins, welcome to our virtual stage.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks very much to Chief Justice Burke and all of those who have put on this terrific event. My only regret is that we're not in person because, as you may be able to tell, I'm a proud Chicagoan and would have loved to have gathered either in Chicago or Springfield or any place else in our great state. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words about what I see as the future that's coming to the legal profession, and hopefully to engage in some discussion with you about those topics. So, Stephen, could you put up my slides? Thank you very much. I want to talk about this idea of value, and as the Chief Justice and others have said, why it's so important. And how we think about that in what we're now taken to calling the new normal that we're coming into after these 2 years. So let me begin here. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times," and we have certainly been through interesting times with not one, not two, but really three interrelated events, right? Obviously, a global public health crisis, an increasingly complex global economic crisis, and growing global calls for sustainability and social justice. And all three of these things, although new, have exposed deep structural challenges that were there long before the current moment and will last long after the current sense of urgency has faded. So globalization, right? And the globalization of all activity, particularly economic activity, and the increasing movement of that activity from the traditional centers of what you might think of as the global North and West to the global South and East, particularly the rise of China. Or how about this? The rise in the speed and the sophistication of information technology and the digital transformation really of all areas of economic, political, and social life. And finally, we have seen what I call a blurring together of traditional categories of organization and thought. That's just a fancy academic way of saying that things that we used to think of as all separate and distinct are increasingly melding together. I don't know, is General Motors a private company or a public company after the US taxpayers dump billions of dollars into it to save it, or the airline industry, let alone state-owned enterprises around the world? Or to pick up on one of the things that's already been said, how about this one? Law and business. When I went to law school, maybe when you went to law school, we were taught that these were completely, totally different things. In fact, law was the antithesis of business. Now, no one who operates in the legal profession can say that, because law and business are now inextricably intertwined. And yet we have to think, as I'll talk about in a minute, what professionalism means in this context. All of these challenges have major implications for the legal profession, and even more importantly, for the public we serve. Now, here's the good news for us as lawyers. In this new world, law and lawyers are going to be more important than ever. Just consider all the new legal work that the COVID crisis has created, right? New laws and programs, redesigned institutions, from government stimulus measures to contact tracing to online courts. We did a whole symposium on online courts. I'm sure the Chief Justice has thought a lot about this. Or how about all the new or revamped policies among our great companies around things like employment, online work, supply chains, data privacy and security? Or how about the new focus on corporate governance more generally and about balancing shareholder value with stakeholder interests and sustainability? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Or how about the tidal wave of reorganizations we've seen in the economy in the last few years, from bankruptcy and restructuring to strategic acquisitions? And there has been an explosion in emphasis on public-private partnerships. The fact that we are all coming back together has a lot to do with the vaccines, of course, which are the creation of both government funding and scientific research, as well as private enterprises. And we see that in healthcare and education and a range of other fields. And finally, it's not just at the local or state or even national level. We have seen a huge number of global compacts and indicators and mandates around the UN Global Compact, sustainability, modern slavery mandates in places like California and the UK. All of these things are only going to be intensified as we see in the war in Ukraine and all of that it is creating for our legal system. All of these these ideas, however, are going to challenge our traditional understandings of what it means to be a lawyer. Yes, lawyers are critical in understanding the new laws and regulations and institutions that are being created in the wake of the pandemic. But law is only a part. And oftentimes we have to be clear, not the most important part of what the world needs to address these issues. We therefore need lawyers who understand the need to provide more than just a legal service or a legal answer to a question, as important as that may be. Lawyers also need to understand how to be a part of, but only a part of, creating solutions to complex problems that extend far beyond law. And this is going to require that we equip lawyers with new skills and new sensibilities about their role. Okay, a lot is new, but it's also important to understand that not everything will or should change. Look, maybe one day, not only will we be doing this, virtually over a technology platform, but maybe one day I'll be a robot and you'll be a robot and we'll all be doing artificial intelligence and mind melding in the metaverse. Maybe. But for the foreseeable future, law remains a human capital business. Notwithstanding everything about technology and all of the organizations in which you work, your most important assets are not the computers, but what we call elevator assets, the people who come in to work with you, go up to your offices in the elevator, work a mere 12 or 14 hours, and come back down at night, and you just hope and pray that they get back on the elevator the next morning, because those are your most important assets, which means that these assets are going to have to continue to be educated, recruited, developed, and managed. That isn't going away. Moreover, we have seen over the last 2 years, and the war in Ukraine highlights this in stark relief, that tradition, stability, the rule of law are more important than ever for lawyers and clients in the world in which we live. Look, if we have discovered that we are not going to deregulate the ride-hailing business, right? Uber and Lyft have found this out. We are certainly not going to deregulate the legal business and the practice of law, because it's too important to fundamental goods that are too important to our world. Moreover, if you want students, the best and the brightest, to do 4 years of undergraduate, 3 years of law school, pass a bar exam and a character and fitness exam just to become lawyers, you have to promise them that there's going to be some stability and predictability in the kinds of careers that they are going to have. Otherwise, people are not going to make those kinds of investments. So the future of our profession is going to be shaped by the interplay of both the forces of change, but also these important forces of continuity. Now, this is critically important, not just for lawyers in private practice, because it's going to affect the role of public lawyers and our public institutions. Look, government lawyers are charged with protecting the vital link between law, democracy, sovereignty, and legitimacy. And that's certainly true for our great judges who are a part of this program. As a result, all the lawyers in the public sector have a critical stake in how changes in the market for legal services I've been talking about are likely to affect things like the core values underlying the rule of law, the responsibility for ensuring access to justice. The Chief Justice just talked about that. The willingness of lawyers to serve as leaders in both government and civil society. This means that public lawyers and judges must be conscious of the way that the private legal market has evolved since they perhaps practice law, and how recent events are likely to turbocharge these changes in the coming years. So let's just think a little bit about all the changes that had happened by 2019 before the world fell off the cliff in March of 2020. First, law in this country and around the world more generally, until the 1960s and 70s, was composed almost exclusively of solo practitioners. I think as late as 1975, something like 75 or 80% of all lawyers were in solo practice or very, very small informal law firms. Increasingly, lawyers practice in organizations of increasing size. This is easiest to see in law firms and legal departments. Sometimes I tell my students that in 1965, Sherman & Sterling was the largest law firm, not just in the United States, but in the world. And it had 169 lawyers. Now 169 lawyers is like the Dayton branch of a Cleveland law firm. Okay. Law firms now have thousands of lawyers, as do in-house legal departments. But that's not just true in the private sector. Look at the size of government law offices. Look at the size of nonprofits. Even plaintiffs' law firms are of increasing size. Law is becoming increasingly an organizational profession in which most lawyers practice in some organizational form. Yet our regulatory system doesn't think about lawyers in organizations. It looks about only regulating lawyers as individual practitioners. And we don't think a great deal about the institutional incentives that practicing in an organizational context pose for lawyers. Second, law was a profession that, let's just say, was not particularly diverse. I tell my students all the time, prior to 1968, anybody could be a lawyer. So long as you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man of means, it was open to talent. We have a long way to go, but law has become an increasingly diverse profession. The most obvious place to look at this is gender. The majority of law students in the United States are now female, and a growing percentage, in many places over 20 or 30%, are people of color and representatives of other diverse groups. We still have a long way to go, but it is an increasingly diverse profession. And yet, at the highest levels, law continues to be dominated, particularly the career paths of law, are not just made for a man, they're made for a man who has a wife who doesn't work. And there are just not that many of those around. We have a mismatch between our demographics and our career paths. Law used to be not only not a very competitive profession, we had rules against competition, against advertising, against practicing law in multiple jurisdictions. We had informal norms against recruiting other lawyers from law firms. All of those have become less and less important. And as the Chief Justice said, it's not just lawyers. We are now competing against all kinds of alternative providers, including technology companies to the big four accounting firms who technically cannot practice law, but are an important part of the legal services market in every place in the world and increasingly here. And yet we don't talk about what it means to be in a world in which lawyers are not the sole part of the practice of law, but are part of an ecosystem of providers that provide a range of services that we have to interact with and compete with, and that our clients use. And that's shifted the way in which we think about what we might think of as the norms of our profession, where we've gone from a kind of artisanal craft idea of professionalism to one that is more and more focused around the economic realities of profit, for better or for worse. As the Chief Justice suggested, we have increasingly sophisticated clients with more and more access to information who are demanding greater transparency and accountability from lawyers. And yet we haven't talked about what professionalism looks like in the context of a market that is increasingly competitive. Finally, we used to have the most local profession in the world, in which lawyers rarely ventured beyond their local legal market, to one in which now it's increasingly global, right? In which not just at a national, a state level or a local level, but even at a national level, that our legal markets are increasingly shaped by what happens around the world. And again, the Ukrainian crisis is only pointing this out in sharp relief. And yet, of course, we know that local institutions and local practices still make a big difference. How do we think about regulating and licensing and practicing in a world in which lawyers are licensed by states, and yet the states are increasingly permeable, as is national boundaries, and in which there is no single legal profession, but in fact a multitude of different kinds of practitioners practicing in different ways? These were challenges all before 2019. They're only being turbocharged by the things that are happening since 2020. And I want to focus around this whole question around sustainability and social justice. So in 1970, Milton Friedman, the famous economist based at the University of Chicago, famously declared the social responsibility of businesses to increase its profits, period, the end. I don't think any business fully took that as a view, but it was the dominant way in which we thought about the responsibilities of business. But even before COVID, this taken for granted presumption was being questioned. So as many of you know, 2018, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, now has $12 trillion under management, declared that it would, quote, look beyond the bottom line to invest in businesses that, quote, contribute to society. The Business Roundtable, don't get much more blue blood than that, followed up by amending its definition of the, quote, purpose of a corporation to include duties to all the company's stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, and the communities in which business operates. In January 2020, right before the world fell off the cliff, BlackRock issued a second letter saying that they were going to immediately stop investing in companies that present, quote, a high sustainability-related risk. And after the pandemic, Davos, the very heart of capitalism around the world, declared that we needed a great reset of capitalism in the wake of the pandemic. And since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it is now clear that social and racial justice have to be a part of this new world. Washington Post said something like $50 billion have been pledged to racial justice initiatives. Look, I spent a lot of time talking to CEOs and boards of directors and general counsels, and I don't know a single one that isn't intently focused on these questions, particularly after a Dutch court told Shell that it now had a mandatory duty to cut its emissions by 45% because they had put that promise in a voluntary sustainability report. And Exxon got 3 environmentalists who were really energy company executives, but pledged towards sustainability, were put on their board by an activist investor. This is now real. And every general counsel in the world is having to deal with these questions. And that's important, not just for general counsels, but for law firms and for government lawyers or anyone else dealing in this area. So we've been studying this, and this is on our website, and you can download this report. We did a big study with EY Legal, which also shows you the importance of the accounting firms these days, in which we surveyed 1,000 general counsels around the world about what's the role of legal in these kind of social justice and sustainability issues. And this just highlights what companies are seeing. If you look at this chart, 66% of people believe that CEOs should be taking responsibility for social issues. 62% of employees think their companies, they should be able to pressure their companies to do so. 78% of investors think that ESG issues are important for investment. 43% of consumers say they should make decisions on this basis. And 46% of boards report increasing pressure from regulators. And this is just a smattering of the kind of new law and regulation that's coming here. I just point out these new sustainability directives that the Securities and Exchange Commission has just floated. The European Green New Deal, all of these sustainability and supply chain mandates. And that means that lawyers are now being asked to think about things like workplace safety, taking a stand on social issues. Everybody's been following what just happened with Disney and the fight with Florida around environmental pledges, diversity, equity, and inclusion, taking things like mandatory arbitration clauses out of for sexual harassment, out of employment agreements. What's the balance between freedom of speech and misinformation? How to think about things like living wages. Think about what kinds of issues these are and what this means for what lawyers are now engaging in, all right? And all of this is going to get pushed even further by generational change. So amidst all the things around 2020, the thing I think people have talked about the least is that in 2020 was the first year that Gen Zs graduated from college. When I first heard this, I said, that's impossible because they were born in 1998. Yeah, that was 22 years ago. And we know now that millennials and Gen Zs, they already make up 38% of the workforce, and they're going to be more than 50% of the workforce in a little more than a decade, all right? And we know these are different generations than the baby boomers and Gen X's who have been running pretty much the world, right? They are born digital, as my colleague John Palfrey wrote way back in 2008. And even more importantly, they are committed to seeking meaning and purpose in their lives. And the pandemic and the protests are only going to heighten these dual commitments. And we are seeing the results of this all throughout the economy, right? And this is particularly important for us because recruitment and retention of lawyers depends upon us having legitimacy and credibly saying we are connected to broader public purposes. But this generation isn't just going to take our word for it. They are going to ask us to be credible about these issues. Look, I don't think that the world has gone through a similarly transformative global set of phenomena since World War II and the Great Depression. And everybody knows that anybody who went through World War II and the Great Depression, like my parents, was forever shaped by those events. I believe that that's going to be true of this generation too. But here's the good news. What do we call that generation? We call them the greatest generation. Why? Because they not only solved the Depression, won World War II, created the international monetary system, started the civil rights movement, created the women's rights and the human rights movement. They were an amazing generation. I believe that the students I'm teaching today and the young people who are in your organizations are similarly capable of great things. But we have to make sure that law schools like mine and organizations like yours prepare them to meet the challenges like the ones that I just discussed. Look, here's what I have often called the paradox of professional distinctiveness. It's just, again, a fancy academic way of saying this. Look, the legal profession is going to be inevitably shaped by what's happening in the world around us. But the more the market is seen as driving legal practice and education, the more questions that are going to be asked about what makes lawyers distinctive and autonomous. That is at the essence of the value question that's being asked by this conference. We know that what should make us distinctive are norms around independence, craft, public service, commitment to the rule of law. These have been central to the idea and prestige and power and attractiveness of legal careers, not just in the United States, but around the world. But if we lose those things, if we don't credibly demonstrate those things, then we risk losing what attracts the best and the brightest to our profession. So we need to think about how do we make our profession sustainable in this new world. And I think this means not just thinking about what we have always thought about in traditional legal education, legal analysis, understanding legal statutes and precedents. I think we also need to begin to teach a set of what my colleague Ben Heineman and Bill Lee and I wrote in a piece talking about the complementary competencies around financial literacy, a basic understanding of information technology, cross-cultural fluency that will allow the new generation of lawyers to contribute to solving the multiplicity of urgent problems at the intersection of law, business, technology, public policy, and morality that we now face. And if we're going to do that, we have to bring these kinds of ideas to the way in which we talk to lawyers and judges and public officials. And that's going to be even harder in this new hybrid world of work. Look, in 2019, I had to convince lawyers that technology was going to have to be an important part of their lives. Now we've just come through 2 years of living our entire lives on Zoom. And no one thinks that we're going to go back to the old ways of working again. And this is just the beginning, okay? And while we know that hybrid work has many advantages, it's allowing us to be together today, it also means there are lots and lots of stresses that we have to learn how to deal with. As a friend of mine said, a very senior lawyer, when I called her up around June of 2020, and I said, how's working from home? She said, I'm not working from home. I'm sleeping at work. And I think many of us know what that feels like. And the idea of what that will mean for our mental and physical health cannot be understated. So we're going to have to pay more attention to that valuable asset I said before, our people, than ever before. Look, we know that well-functioning teams must be excellent on 3 interconnected dimensions. 1, they have to produce excellent work. But 2, every team member must believe that the team is committed to their well-being and development. And 3, that team must create a learning environment that facilitates continuous improvement. Here's the thing we also know. In high-stress environments, there is a constant danger that the first, producing excellent work, will swamp the other 2. Yet when team members no longer believe in the second and third, the first inevitably suffers. And guess what else happens? Team members leave. And that's particularly true for women and people of color who do not feel that they are in a supportive learning environment that values their diversity. But paying attention to this requires time and attention, and it will not be easy. Look, I often say, only half jokingly, that law is the only business in the world in which you can't say anything new unless you definitively prove that someone said it before. That's called precedent, okay? It's valuable, but not exactly a growth mindset, okay? And we know that legal organizations and even more individual lawyers can easily retreat to their comfort zone. But lawyers can also move outside of that zone to use this moment to make real change. And as history has repeatedly shown, in the proper translation of this old Roman proverb that Matt Damon is using to hawk cryptocurrency, fortune favors the bold. So here's what I'll leave you. I think we need to move toward a bold new partnership, one in which lawyers, academics, policymakers, judges work together to understand the profound changes taking place in our world and to craft wise policy that helps support the best of these changes while preserving the legal system's core value. And that is why I'm so honored to have the opportunity to discuss these important issues with you at this important event.